Okay, well, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's seminar on sustainability. So for those who haven't joined us before, this is part of the Anthropocene Histories seminars series that's been running for a few years now. And we've had many participants on a number of different exciting topics. And these past seminars were recorded and can be watched. So today's is also being recorded, as I think you'll know from your Zoom notifications. So what we do is we record the panel section and we don't record the questions, just to keep it as a freer discussion later on. So we'll hear from both the speakers first, and then we'll take questions afterwards as a sort of collective reflection on what we've heard. So the thinking behind the seminar today is the quite complex subject of sustainability for historians. So it is obviously for many of us, it's an anachronistic concept, and it might be considered a sort of presentist concern. And I think as historians have come to wonder about past sustainabilities, there are some questions that both our speakers today have pondered on of what is sustainability in the past? Are we adopting what we might consider to be quite problematic definitions that come from policy bodies or from ecological research? These are very, very different ideas of what might constitute sustainability. Are either quite what we want? Can we mix them together? Are they incompatible? And if we don't like definitions that work to describe today's problems and today's concepts, then what exactly is it that we might find in the past that's kind of instructive and useful in this sort of area of thinking? And it does open up a lot of broader questions that I think many of us are interested in about how, I suppose, how people in past societies inhabited their worlds and what they thought about them, and what were their preoccupations and concerns in thinking about how to live in places and how to interact with the world around them and the things that it had to offer, which we might now call resources, but they might not have called resources and might not have even thought of in those terms. And it also opens up quite a lot of questions about ideas about human nature. We're constantly being told that humans are greedy and self-interested, and therefore that therefore is something that historians might work with, or they might want to seriously call into question. And if we don't have today's kind of this is human nature, and therefore what does it look like in the past? So there are a lot of really interesting questions for historians of different periods, picking up these modern concepts and kind of running with them in various different directions and working out where they work and where they don't work, and how we might set the past against them to offer different ways of looking at it. So I think this is very fruitful for historians, but I think the other question that's wrapped up in this seminar is what we can offer to the world now. And it's something that we do, and perhaps that we also don't do quite enough as historians, of saying things were different in the past. We don't have to assume that we're on a fixed track. And I mean, I guess the sort of most well-known intervention in the Anglophone world at the moment is Graeber and Wengrow's Dawn of Everything, which is sort of, quite a controversial book for many, but it kind of quite consciously says, look, people, we think this looked very different in the past, and therefore can we break the kind of tight hold of how we assume things have to work now? And it's a sort of interesting task that we can take on. I think for those of us who are working on pre-modern periods and who aren't so obviously participants in these conversations, so we're not looking at industrialization or kind of modern global economic processes that most people, even if they're not historians, can see as sort of relevant. If we're working on earlier periods than that, it is kind of essential to be making cases for our importance so that we don't get kind of washed away in funding cuts or other kind of challenges. And I think obviously that's a strategic concern there, but I think that there are huge intellectual concerns there to put these worlds into conversation. So these are some of the things that we had in mind when we were thinking about this seminar, is the sort of roles that we can play, but also, I guess, the risks and benefits for the quality of our thinking about the past, but also for what we can offer as historians. And hopefully much more will come to light as we talk. So I will stop now and hand over to our first speaker for today, who's Riccardo Rao from the University of Bergamo. So Riccardo teaches medieval history and environmental and animal history, and he's published books recently on landscapes in medieval Italy and on walls. So if I can hand over to you, Riccardo.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you very much for the invitation. And apologies because I'm going to, I will read my text. In the late Middle Ages, the environment was under pressure. Population growth, deforestation, and the expansion of cultivated land were changing the face of the medieval landscape. In response to this emergency, medieval communities organized themselves to develop management practices that we might call sustainable. Starting with some examples from northern Italy, I will show why medieval sustainability is largely a social construct, and certainly not, anachronistically, an ecological one. The first point I would like to focus on concerns commons. Commons fully responded to the need to ensure the long-term management of certain environmental resources by establishing rules for their use. This effort has a lasting impact on the European landscape. In various parts of the continent, commons have survived to the present day as environmental assets of a high ecological value, particularly in less urbanized areas. Thus, they represent a fundamental cultural heritage with a historical roots. I will give just one example from the Central Alps. The Statutes of Bormio established the office of the Advocati Nemorum, literally forest advocates, in charge of the safeguarding and conservation of the common woods. In order to ensure the sustainability of the woodland, the trees to be felled were mostly distributed across several forests and had to be marked one by these officers. In this way, the careful management of forested areas ensured that the population's need for timber did not cause irreversible damage to the woodland. In many mountainous and hilly areas, such regulations, as well as, for instance, the prohibition of forest fires, helped to preserve the agroforestry heritage. However, here I would like to explore the dark side of medieval sustainability. Let's take a look at the commons. In late medieval Italy, many commons were managed as private assets. Communities rented them out and allowed them to be cultivated. Only a small part of the vast land they owned was reserved for pasture and woodland, while the rest was sold to fund infrastructures or to reduce taxes. Even common woodlands were transformed to meet the needs of the population. For example, by increasing the area devoted to chestnut trees. This aspect can be interpreted in two ways. Replacing beech and oak trees with chestnuts increased the overall biodiversity and also introduced a pollinating species for bees. On the other hand, it also had a significant impact on the original forest. Here, I would like to emphasize that late medieval communities were well organized and socially stratified. Their management of the commons, therefore, transformed the environment and reflected their social hierarchies. Let me give you another example, this time from a different alpine locality, Ormea in the Ligurian Alps. The 13th century statutes specifically regulated the use of each tree species, establishing a functional and value-based hierarchy of trees. More than 1 in 10 regulations was dedicated to the forest, making it the most controlled and protected asset in the area. Penalties for felling fir and cultivated trees were 5 times higher than those for oaks, conifers, oaks, apple trees, cherry trees, birches, and chestnuts all received special protection due to their usefulness. Fir trees, in particular, were used for the construction of masts for Genoese ships, and their felling was permitted only to certain professional woodsmen who paid a fee to the community. Apart from that, the local inhabitants were allowed to use the wood only to build their houses. In the lower areas, Ormea's statutes required chestnut trees to be planted, 8 for each sestarium of land. The foliage of oaks and walnuts was used as winter fodder for livestock, unlike birch leaves, which were forbidden for this purpose, since birches were primarily used for wicker work. The pruning of beech branches, the scalvatura, was also strictly controlled. Producing wooden objects in the forest and an activity likely involving various farmers during the winter was allowed only after paying a fee, the boscagem. Each forest was individually surveyed and protected, with severe penalties for those who cut wood indiscriminately. Repeatedly issued regulations also suggest that deforestation, the conversion of communal forests to farmland, were widespread at the time, as they explicitly prohibited such actions. In short, despite the restriction imposed by the statutes, the forests were under attack, and it is significant that in 1350, 2 generations after the statutes were enacted, the community issued a new rule prohibiting the felling of fir trees in certain forests for 10 years, likely to allow regeneration, with substantial penalties 30 times higher than for cutting down oak trees. This regulation, reflecting sustainability practices, viewed the environment as a set of heavily human-modified and intensively exploited resources. But that's not all. The strict regulation, rather hyper-regulation of pasture and woodland in late medieval Italy, was largely designed for the benefit of those who profited from the commons, the local inhabitants, and especially those with enough resources to pay taxes or own property. It was primarily this group that demanded rules to protect exclusive access to the commons, gradually marginalizing the free grazing and wood gathering activities of the poorer population. Late medieval regulations could exclude immigrants and those who paid taxes. I'm not suggesting that the sustainability of the commons in late medieval Italy was for the wealthy, but it's clear that this system of rules and sustainable practices had a social background. It was designed with a social hierarchy in mind, which varied from place to place, but was consistently driven by social competition. Allow me to give just one example relating to the city of Alessandria in the 13th century. The commune statutes established a complex system to prevent forest depletion. The forests were divided into sections, and in each section, wood cutting was only permitted every 6 years to allow the coppice to regenerate. Wood cutting operations were strictly supervised by communal officers, and this was certainly a sustainable system. However, the sections were allocated on the basis of the citizens' declarations in the tax register, the so-called estimo. This way, sustainable forest management was achieved by limiting access to those who paid direct taxes. Nearly 2 centuries later, let's move on to an alpine community, Ardesio, near Bergamo. The late medieval statutes of this locality established a system of sustainable management of alpine pastures and fir forests, with limited access for livestock to the pastures and strict control over the felling of firs. What is unique about these regulations, however, is that access to coniferous forests and alpine pastures, the main local assets, is managed indirectly through contracts. The whole system was essentially privatized, and sustainability was ensured by requiring those accessing the pastures and forests to pay fees in addition to following the strict regulations of the statutes. For example, the statute stipulated that only those who paid a fee could access the alpine pastures with their animals for more than 3 nights. The valuable coniferous forests were under extremely strict protection, with no one allowed to cut down, prune, or make charcoal. Each forest was demarcated with precise boundaries to prevent encroachment. Woodcutting in these forests was only granted to a limited number of contractors. The commune restricted cutting to a regulated number of trees, numbered individually by local councils. In practice, however, the resource was largely limited to private investors with substantial economic resources. Local inhabitants, only those who paid taxes, were allowed minimal use of this forest, limited to collecting timber for building houses, and only with the commune's authorization. Although Ardesio's solution was particularly radical, requiring payment even from residents of the community, Similar rules can be found in many alpine statutes, usually aimed primarily at outsiders. Even with indirect taxation, sustainable management of pastures involved a process of fiscalization of the environmental resources here as well. In summary, the restriction of collective forests and pastures and the establishment of sustainable access system to resources, albeit one that discriminated on the basis of wealth or origin, led to numerous social conflicts within late medieval Italian communities, and many studies have now been published on this aspect. There's another dark side to medieval sustainability, and it concerns animals. Let's clarify one point right away. The careful management of commons, pastures, and woodlands was not designed by medieval societies with animal welfare in mind. We have numerous examples that show that as the rules for access of the commons became stricter, the presence of animals was also strictly regulated and differentiated according to sex and species. There were pastures only for sheep and pastures only for cows. There were pastures where male animals were not allowed. And private and communal pastures are increasingly fragmented, often fenced in, restricting the free movement of both domestic and wild animals. These regulations, obviously, aimed at a more efficient livestock management, were certainly not intended to increase biodiversity. Moreover, we need only to look at what happened at the same time to wild species, which were significantly reduced, especially large carnivores. Wolves, lynxes, and bears were severely culled and in some cases hunted to extinction. For example, the alpine communities of Bormio, Ardesio, and Dormea all ordered the hunting of wolves and bears. The extermination of large carnivores is just another aspect of the focus on the protection of high-value environmental resources that results from the rules governing the use of forests and pastures, and it is, in a sense, perfectly congruent. But even other wild species almost disappeared. Here too, the rules of medieval sustainability were based on a social hierarchy. Let me share my screen just briefly. To introduce this wonderful animal, the alpine partridge, now endangered due to climate change. In the late Middle Ages, it became a fashionable delicacy on aristocratic tables, probably because of its rarity. For this reason, despite the cold climate phase that should have allowed the population to increase, its range shrunk nearly to the point of disappearance. In Bormio, the hunting of partridges with nets was forbidden, as it risked endangering the presence of the species, whereas hunting with birds of prey was tolerated, thus de facto favoring aristocratic hunting activities. It would be wrong to think that medieval society had an ecological understanding in the modern sense, nor would it make sense to expect them to adhere to the 5 freedoms for animals formulated by Roger Bramble in 1965. Freedom from hunger and thirst, freedom from discomfort, freedom from pain, injury, or disease, freedom to express normal behavior, freedom from fear and distress. However, livestock farming, which was more intensive than in the early Middle Ages, ultimately compromised animal welfare. It is perhaps also telling that from the late 14th century onward, at least in the medieval Lombardy, mentions of epizootics became more frequent. In Ardesio, for example, statutes established numerous rules regarding sick animals, including the provision to kill guard dogs in case of infection. To address these apparent contradictions in the sustainable management of the medieval environment, we may need to reflect on the very concept of sustainability in medieval societies. Undoubtedly, medieval societies, perhaps especially early medieval ones, had extensive knowledge of many ecological relationships. However, rather than being driven by an ecological spirit, their approach to the environment was dominated by utility. In other words, they intervened in the environment primarily to exploit economic resources. In fact, it could be said that late medieval society transformed the environment into a set of economic resources that were strictly protected, but also deeply hierarchized on the basis of social use and animal species. The overall impact on biodiversity is ambivalent. For example, while the development of alpine pastures or transhumance could be seen as practices that increase biodiversity, the elimination of wild species and certain practices of genetic selection in livestock had the opposite effect. Finally, in order to understand medieval sustainability practices, I think it would be useful to ask what sustainability means to historians, and medieval historians in particular. After all, medievalists were concerned with these issues long before the concept of sustainability was formulated in the 1970s. But the notion of sustainability used by medievalists has been linked to the durability of economic profit. From Postan's research on soil fertility to recent neo-institutional studies on the commons, they have thus focused more on economic and social sustainability than on environmental sustainability. Today, however, historians must engage with a concept that has evolved over time, forcing us to speak of sustainability in the plural. Many thanks.
Thank you very much. So I think we'll move just straight on to Annette's talk now, if we may. So I'd like to introduce Annette Kehnel as our second speaker today. So she's chair in medieval history at the University of Mannheim. She studied history and biology, which I think is worth our noting, perhaps, at the universities of Freiburg, Oxford, and Munich, and also studied at Trinity College Dublin and did postdoctoral research in Dresden. She was appointed to her chair in Mannheim in 2005. She's published a lot of works on her main topics of research, cultural economic history, historical anthropology. But I think that we'll perhaps be most familiar with her recent prize-winning book, which has been translated into English as The Green Ages, Medieval Innovations in Sustainability. So if I could hand over to you, Annette.
Amanda, thank you very much. And Riccardo, thank you very much for this very concrete medieval example. I tried to share my screen in the first place and hope I'll manage this time. My screen is always disappearing when I try to open it. I don't know why. Wait. I try again. We tried it out before and it worked. So I don't want to give you your screener. I want to take. Why am I so stupid? I'm very sorry, but we managed. We managed before, so I'm sure we will manage now.
I think it's the Finder again. But we got there last time, we'll get there again.
We were there before. I'm so stupid. Wait a minute. It's again the same? No.
What happens if you open the presentation?
First of all, yeah, that's what I try. So, yeah. Right. So, but now I can Better?
There you
Thank
are.
God.
Good.
Thank you for your patience. I always, gives you time to take a bio break. I will talk about the rest is history, the role of the past in Anthropocene histories, and maybe really take over from Riccardo. I'm giving my paper from Karonga in Malawi, where we have a research and museum center. And I like to work in sort of situations of the long durée. So here people are excavating hominid remains in the project called Hominid Corridor Research. And it's, of course, one of the big questions, what we know about humans in the long durée. And I think that's very inspiring for me. But what I really sort of got to think about and work about is the question how what we know about the past matters for what we do about the future. And that's really the starting point of my my paper and also of my reflections on the role of histories, the role of the past, and especially the role of us historians in current discourse. So I start with the Brundtland Report. We could also start in 1972 with the limits of growth by the Club of Rome. At that time, we know that Gro Brundtland, she said, scientists bring to our attention urgent but complex problems. We know what we have to do: warming globes, threats to the Earth's subzone, ozone, deserting, consuming agricultural land, etc., etc. And then, interestingly enough, in 2022, the same woman, Gro Harlem Brundtland, she says, the facts are known, but nothing has been done. I would say not nothing, but maybe not enough. So no action was taken to protect the global commons enough. No actions to prevent massive overfishing of the oceans. No actions to stop ocean plastic. Little action to stop deforestation, and too little to reduce carbon dioxide emission. So this is really sort of a very sobering piece of information. 40 years, and more than 50 years, in fact, since 1972, and so little has happened. And my question really is, why are we so change averse? Why is transformation promoted so slowly, all too slowly? And in fact, quite the opposite was the case. A lot of the problems we are fighting with today have been caused only in the last 50 years, So we experienced an acceleration of the devastating methods in economics, in economy, and so on. So why are we so change averse, despite the fact that we would know what to do? Now, there are different answers. One of them is, of course, we think we can stop a development by refusing to take notice of it. That's a very famous one, this image of the Beacon Golf Club, burning woods. The world is in flames, but we need just to finish. We need really to finish our game in the first place. So we ignore what's happening. A second one is, we have it in Germany, we have it all over the place, blame others. So in this case, not climate change is the problem, but the legislation for the protection of climate change is the real danger. So blame others for doing this. So we have explanations for change aversion. We would call ignoring the facts as deliberate ignorance or status quo bias, and that's a matter of behavioral economics. And then, of course, fear of loss. That's always a very strong issue, and that's a psychological issue. But now I'm neither behavioral economist nor I'm psychologist. I'm a historian. So what can the historical perspective add to this change averse, to the fact that to explain and maybe also to change this sort of hesitance in doing something? And I think that historical explanations for change aversion, the role is very closely linked with the role of the past. It's more about, not about what us historians do know, but rather what you know, all these people who don't have the time and the privilege to do historical work all the time and to work with the sources we have. So it's more about tacit knowledge. It's about the collective memory, and it's about imagined pasts, traditional knowledge about the past. So if you want, we can say it's about narratives that are common in use outside the world of strict historical research and teaching. So that's what's really interesting me. And there I would say the historical part of this problem is dominant or prevailing narratives of the past. And one of them I would call Tina. Tina, I think you should know it because it was invented in England. It's called Tina. There is no alternative. Margaret Thatcher had that slogan, you know, there is no alternative to growth and to capitalism and to sort of insulate individuals. You know, she once said there is no such thing as a society. There are only individuals. So there is no alternative. It's not Margaret Thatcher who I'm talking about, but it's the thinking that we would like to change things. We would like to put less emission in the environment and so on and so forth. But unfortunately, there is no alternative to growth, to economic expansion, to more wealth, and obviously to more riches. So there are other myths about in public brain. So there is, for example, the myth of no alternative to private property. That was Garrett Hardin's big success in 1968, the tragedy of the commons. What belongs to all will be destroyed by all. So we only have private property as the solution. Another myth I often find is there is no alternative to capitalism. Deirdre McCloskey, an economic historian in the US, she said, you know, asking her colleagues about their ideas about history, they would all say, once upon a time we were poor, then capitalism flourished, and now as a result we are rich. So that's a sort of common understanding idea in the minds if you talk with people who are not historians or not economic historians, the underlying idea of a progressing, ever progressing society with all its negative implications down to, you know, the post-colonial problematic. And then finally, there is no alternative to rational choice, to the homo economicus. People do what they do because they seek individual advantage. That's sort of the idea about the individual. Gary Becker's the economic way of looking at life is one of the key texts for that. But of course, it's very well grounded also in theories, in you know, still in current studies in the social field. So these are sort of, there is no alternative myth, if you want, in public or maybe non-historical brains. And it's knowledge which you don't really learn. It's knowledge which is underlying and it's all around, all over the place. And you don't really know where you have it from. It's tacit knowledge. It's sort of subconscious knowledge as well. Now, Eleanor Ostrom, the one who really sort of got the Nobel Prize for questioning this, she sort of called these myths under complex worldviews of the 20th century. So she would say the 20th century, the dominant scholarly effort was to try to fit the world into simple models and to criticize institutional arrangements that did not fit in. So her idea about under complex worldviews of the 20th century would be there are only two optimal organizational forms, namely markets and governments. There are only two types of goods, namely private good and public good. And there are only one model, there is only one model of the individual, namely the fully rational, fully informed decision maker with clear preferences. Sort of the individual that's underlying the rational choice idea. And she, of course, Eleanor Ostrom, she made a very, very strong impact and also a strong voice to there are alternatives. Her own contribution was that in governing the commons, trying to work out the rules of commons as an alternative to private property in her famous and also Nobel Prize winning study governing the commons. So there are alternatives to capitalism, and these are only very placative. And I mean, we could talk about each of these mythologies in detail, but I just put on Thomas Piketty, who shows as one of many that the idea that capitalism will rise public wealth and global wealth has been a trap. It's not true. And finally, there are alternatives to Homo economicus. So we have The Rational Fools by Amartya Sen, or we have Homo Cooperans, Tina de Moore, who's doing valuable work on the commons in Rotterdam, or cooperative individualism, that's Ulla Kupta, a German historian in Hamburg. So there are alternatives to the model of the Homo economicus and have been around long. I mean, the Homo economicus had been criticized very much. So I think we are sort of in a situation where we can say Tina is gone and now it's time for Tara. There are reasonable alternatives. And I think the past is one of the inspirational resources we have today to remind people of the fact that there are alternatives. And that's what I'm actually trying in my book, The Green Ages. The first chapter is dedicated to the question, was everybody poor before we invented capitalism? I love that chapter, and it was so great fun to write it. It was also a good discussion with Steven Pinker. In books like his on violence, you find all these narratives about progress, he starts with a poor girl in the Middle Ages and then ending in the 19th century, just to demonstrate how desperate it was in past times, and only when we changed things with capitalism, things got better. And then I tried to put case studies forward about sharing, about recycling, microfinance, minimalism. The German version also has a chapter on crowdfunding. Basically, I tried to show that, ecological, economical, and social sustainability, or what we call like that today, can be seen and found in societies that lived and flourished before us. So just to give you an idea, very few cases, the fishery at the Lake of Constance, it has been worked out by Michael Zeheter, a colleague of mine from Trier, and he wonders how this lake has been used as a cooperative resource from 1350 to 1800, really. 1900 is a printing mistake, but to 1800, without ever being sort of worked out. And he shows, I mean, here you have all the shareholders, if you want, the monastery of St. Gall, the monastery of the Reichenau, the Cistercian monastery of Salem, and then different cities, bishops, and all were sort of holding their share at the lake, and it was open to all, and the lake was renewable but limited as a resource. So intensive exploitation would have been an option for the individual user, and still there was somehow a management that avoided this over-exploitation. What was the reason that this worked out? In fact, that what Eleanor Ostrom in her Managing the Commons calls communication, collective choices, and flexible regulations decided upon on a local level. Now that's a very, very important thing about the management of commons, flexible regulations. So these people around the Lake of Constance, they met yearly in so-called Fischertage, fishing days. They organized themselves, agreed, well, first of all, on the situation in the lake, how many fish, how is the weather, how is the demand, and what can we offer, which resources, which fish do we need to protect, and which is there too much. And then they would, in a yearly or 5-yearly rhythm or whatever, whenever needed, change the regulations and adapt them to the needs of the present time. And that's very, very important. So you have adaptable norms. In the 19th century, I mean, we have an awful lot of fishing regulations from the Lake of Constance in the archives, and they would just be sort of seen as, oh, this didn't work. They always had to change the rules, you know. But now we say no, quite the opposite is the case. The fact that they could change the rules and adapt them to the present need, maybe make the meshes of their nets wider if they wanted to protect a certain fish. That was the secret of the success. So this is one example just for a way of sort of economic sustainability, if you want, because of course they didn't think about ecology and sustainability, but it was sort of a strategy of survival to manage this resource in a way that their children and grandchildren would also have something to eat. So it's, if you want, pure utilitas, to use the resource in a way that makes sense for the rest of the world. So this was the one example I would try to do it a bit more in detail, but you could also say what Riccardo just showed, you know, wood cooperatives and then social sustainability with Monte di Pietà, micro institutions of microfinance, if you want. And again, very solidly organized and very carefully put through. Tanja Skambrax, my colleague now in Graz, she worked that out, in this case for the Monte in Rome. And we have an awful lot of sources by that. I mean, far too many sources, because they are the Italian archives are filled with them, and you don't want to spend your lifetime by looking through the account books, but you see how microcredit was given to potentially poor or impoverishing burghers of the rich cities in Italy. So, and then the final example would be crowd sharing with the bridge in Avignon, where you just see how people cooperated in the creation and in the management of common projects. In this case, one person, Benesset, who started the building of the bridge in 1270 something, because Avignon desperately needed a bridge, and it was started by one person, a very young man from the mountains, and then carried on, and they managed to build a bridge with all the sort of cooperation of the shareholders in Avignon, from the bishop to the city council to the local entrepreneurs, and then a group of so-called bridge brothers took over, and they managed the bridges as a common resource. And you see how successful this idea was when you look at the distribution of bridge brotherhoods in the south of France at the time. Okay, this is the end of my paper. I don't want to, well, I want to inform you in the end that in German, my book is called "We Could Have Done Differently. Wir konnten auch anders." So it's really opening the space of imagination, not to imitate what people did in former days, but to show that there is more than Homo economicus and capitalism and private property to the ways human communities managed their survival and oncoming. Thank you very much. I hope I wasn't too long, and I go back to the community now.
Many thanks for the paper. Just while everyone's collecting their thoughts and hopefully putting some questions in the chat, I had a couple of things that actually, first of all, a small question to you, Annette, prompted by your last slide. I did notice that the title's not only different in English, but has quite a different resonance. And I just wondered if you had, whether you could explain that, because it makes the book carry a different message to my mind.
Actually,
I think we may have lost you.
Say, you know, this is actually what's all right for the British and also for the American market. In the States, it's Brandeis University Press who is actually printing it. And they both agreed the Green Ages and medieval innovations in sustainability. There is no really, in German we have a film called Wir können auch anders, which is a very funny film that came out after the reunification, and it's about East and West conflicts. And it shows that, the worlds that clash open up new space for for doing things in a different way. But that film never made it outside Germany. So it's also maybe a question of how would you translate Wir konnten auch anders into reasonable English.
Yeah, I can see that. It's a sort of interesting problem, I guess, of
yes, it is.
trade book writing as well, which is something we're talking about in the last seminar. The other question that I had for you both, in different ways, you touched on these sorts of questions of, I guess, kind of normative ideas about sustainability. So in particularly the monastic example in your book, Annette, was making me think about this. So a pedantic medievalist could say, oh, but in practice, one thing or another, and we do this to each other all the time. But as a kind of structure for how to live, it does work very nicely as a kind of a sort of possible alternative way of doing things. And with Riccardo's kind of discussion about how there are these strategies for sustainability, but they often are monopolized by certain groups, and they embed not only hierarchies amongst different humans, but very starkly and horribly hierarchies between humans and animals and plants, and everyone else is caught up in this. And so I suppose I was thinking, when we're trying to, particularly when we're trying to communicate beyond the discipline, what's the best way of handling this to both give counsel and advice to our contemporaries, but to do it in a way that's sufficiently nuanced that we're happy with it, but also clear and possibly normative enough to offer, I don't know, templates if that's what we want to do. I'd be interested to know what you both think about that.
Well, I can say maybe one thing. Dipesh Chakrabarty, he said in his book on the climate of history, he said, we only now we become aware how deeply how our modern building of individual freedom is built on fossil energies or fossil that we nowadays call sustainable methods. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. It has, of course, a lot to do with maybe stepping back from what we thought to be individual freedom. But then I say, maybe we reached a state where many of us are rather sort of it's over demanded by individual freedom. So take, for example, the next book I wrote was on deadly sins, and I'm talking about gula and eating too much. So the problem today is not that we have too much regulations in terms of taking in calories, but quite the opposite. Individual decision making is so easily abused by those who make profit with selling food that individual decisions actually, and the goodbye from norms like eating jointly or eating regularly or not eating too much and so on and so forth actually falls back on us. So I think we might have to sort of get back to what the minimalists of the 1970s, like Ernst Schumacher, called the human measure, sort of the human, to that what is good for humans and animals and nature, rather than trying to defend individual freedom to a level where we can say, listen, there are, of course, it was no Ponyhof to live. We say that in German. Es war kein, das Leben ist kein Ponyhof. It was not living on a pony farm, living in a medieval common. I could go on, you know, it was also not about equality. I mean, this was an unequal society, of course, but we can't blame these people for not being equal. Or the Monte di Pietà, the microfinance institutions. No, it was not about making everybody rich. It was not about giving a chance to every dishwasher to become a millionaire. No, it was about enabling the person who is doing the washing up in the kitchen to live a life in dignity. So I think that's maybe a warning by myself to not mix everything all together, but rather respect the difference of societies that live before us without judging them for not living up to our standards nowadays.
Yes, and if I may add something, well, I was really convinced by Annette's idea of the terra, and also I agree that the role of collectivity and communities is something we can convey as historians in the present, in the nowadays, in the current debate. There are maybe two more things we can convey in this debate. The first one is complexity. So I think what I've tried to show is that sustainability is not a neutral concept. It implies parties, political choices, social competition. And the second one is also our role as a human being, as human beings inside the concept of sustainability. The first definition of sustainability I have found, for instance, the United Nations Declaration of Stockholm. They all speak of, they use the adjective sustainable related to development, so sustainable development, and they support the idea of a sustainable development for the future generation. So they are human-focused, I say, definitions. And so what's the role of the animals in these, or of the ecosystems? Of course, there are other definitions of sustainability starting from the 80s, which insist on the concept of equilibrium or balance between human needs and the environmental response. But I think there is still an ambiguity in the debate. And so we should also think there is, in sustainability, in the concept of sustainability, there is something, it's not for profit, it's just for free. So the concept of sustainability should be thought, I think, something also, something beyond human beings. And so, yeah.
So how do you think we gather everyone or all living things into the concept of sustainability as it's used now? Because does that require kind of bashing that concept away, using a different word, trying to put more into that particular word? What's in your mind when you're suggesting that?
So can you repeat this? You mean?
Sorry, I was just thinking, so when you're talking about all the other elements that should be in sustainability, so the animals and the different groups of people and possibly the plants, if we want to bring them into it as well, is sustainability as it stands a concept that can do that? Or does it need to be reimagined within the word saying sustainability? Are there other words that do that better?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think the idea of I think the current definition of sustainability is very good. So I have probably Richard Hoffman's definition of sustainability. You know, their fundamental book, An Environmental History of Medieval Europe. He says. Sustainability is a dynamic equilibrium between human activities in nature and the ability of the natural system to respond to those activities. So I think the problem is not the definition. The problem is to make concrete this definition in our strategies towards the environment.
Annette, did you have anything you wanted to say about that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, you know, there is alternatives like Gaia, or what, you know, I think Donna Haraway, she has this unspeakable alternative, Holocene or something like it, trying to sort of especially get rid of the problem, what you said, Riccardo, of development, because that's a core problem to sustainability in terms of that it is still sort of deeply rooted in an understanding of global history as one that is to be developed towards the standard of the Western world. And I think that is a problem. Yeah. So Donna Haraway, but I mean, I can't really do much with her Holocene, but she is one of those protagonists who she says we need to develop a sort of a world view of belonging together rather than wanting to go somewhere. Or if you put it into the words of a German philosopher, Odo Marquardt, he said, you know, we don't need to change the world. It's enough if we just leave it quiet, if we stop doing all the things that are sort of doing harm to it. I think that's another sort of might be another offer. But Genevieve is actually raising her hand. Sorry. Let me know if I'm talking too much, because sometimes I am a bit chatty.
You're not talking too much. And Geneva, would you ask your question?
Hi, yeah, thank you. I just want to say thank you, Riccardo, for your presentation. That was amazing. And Annette, it's so exciting to see you. We were discussing your book. I study in John's medieval environmental module. We were referring to your book recently. So my question was actually for Amanda. I wonder if you could expand on the part of your introduction. You touched on this mammoth book, The Dawn of Everything. I've only read sections because it's so long, but in my political organizing, I found it quite useful. And I wondered how to place it in the conversations from today's seminar. I mean, when we were talking about your book, Annette, some of the thoughts I've had from that come up. So I was wondering where you placed it, Amanda, why you thought it was relevant.
Well, I suppose from my perspective, and I'd quite like to hear from the others on this as well, actually, but my sense about it was that it was a kind of quite bold and provocative book that lots of people have argued with on the basis of their own area. Yet the kind of underlying purpose of it was to say we have thought other ways human societies have consciously organized themselves against the systems that we now see as completely intractable, and therefore let's, I suppose, liberate our imaginations a little bit. I saw that as the kind of underlying message of this kind of vast series of discussions. And it felt to me when I was reading Annette's book, it felt as if there was a sort of similar intention. Just to, because it seems that there's such a heavy consensus that we can only do things in one particular way because of our nature. I guess that's what I was saying at the beginning, and and also we know that there's a lot of money from fossil fuel industries and others going into publicizing that idea as the only possible idea, and then we have people at at COP saying that the Sortenel could be last year saying, we'll go back to caves if we actually sort this problem out in the way that you want to. So we have to keep going. So I suppose that kind of, I feel like you can't have too many things at the moment that attempt to break that from a position of authority in a different period. Annette, sorry, I'm talking too much.
Just briefly, Genevieve, I think this is very, very important. And also what you said, Amanda, that we have really sort of also very often a naturalized understanding of human nature. And we think that, you know, things are as they are because it's our nature. I mean, that's my biology part of the study, where I try to argue against very strongly. No, it's not our nature, it's our culture. The nature of humans, you know, it's no worse and no better than that of other mammals, but their culture is a different one. So it's really all about decision making. Which culture do we want? And there I agree. Thank you, Amanda, for giving me that word, liberating our imagination. I think that's really the key task of historians, I would say.
We have a question in the chat from a little while ago. If people who've got their hands up don't mind, I'll just put that one first. It's I'm not quite sure who it's from actually, and I don't know if the person who asked it wants to ask it themselves, but as it's put in the chat is talking about individual freedom. A lot of the ways progress inequality is measured is by how well people in historically marginalized groups can access wealth and opportunities. Does this breed more individualism and inadvertently maintain that there is no alternative narratives? Can I throw that over to one or both speakers?
I think the measurement of individual freedom is indeed one of the main tasks of our social science colleagues. But then I think access to resources is very important, access to social upward mobility and so on. But we have to be careful because, I mean, ideas about individual freedom are very sort of context depending. So I keep saying, you know, poverty or not. In the eyes of my children, I really had a deprived childhood, a deprivated childhood. I was poor. Why? Well, because I grew up without a mobile phone. So I think we just have to be very careful with all the social science methodology, because very often I have the impression they argue implicitly anachronistic and also gender biased, of course, and other biases. But they argue, the problem as well that, I mean, the most of the data we have from in social science are white students in the US, in the North Americas, because they have produced most of the input in data into all the Befragungen, what is it? I think, in the interviews and the case studies. So I think there is a big bias, and that's again, I think we should also make sure that other disciplines get a more sort of context sensitive and sensible approach.
Thank you. Riccardo, did you want to come in on that one before we have another question?
Well, no, but if I was reading also John's question about this point. So if I came back on his comment, I agree about the fact that we have well, we can find in the past alternative ways to organize the society. Also, Waingro and Graeber's book is a good example of it. The problem is, I think, how do we idealize this kind of society? that's the problem. As historians, we can't idealize that past experiences. I think that we have a lot of examples of collective organizations in the past, of a stronger role of communities, for example. This is very clear also in Annette examples. So communities in the past, during the late Middle Ages and the early modern era, were able to have a strong influence in the organization and the management of the landscape and the environment. But individualism was absent there. I don't think so. I mean, I think that that kind of collective organizations, of communities, was structured with strong competition between different social groups. And so the difficult point for us as historians is to find a balance, an equilibrium between to find inspirations and to enhance the role, the collective forms of organization of the past, on the one hand, and on the other hand, to show the complexity of the social competition and avoiding to idealize this form of collectivity. And probably it depends also on our education as historians and our ideas as historians. For instance, the Marxist, the neo-Marxist scholars tends to identify strong fractures in the past, usually at the beginning of the early modern era, early modern period, or with the industrialization period. And they insist on the breakthrough created by globalism or industrialization. I tend to see also the continuity between, I say, before and after this breakthrough, and maybe also to nuance a little these conflicts.
So thank you. I think if I've got this right, I think, Andrew, did you have your hand up first? And would you like to put your question?
I think it was Sophie first.
Oh, well, okay. Sophie,
I'll let you go. I'll let you go first, Sophie.
Thank you for two incredibly stimulating talks. Yeah, I have lots of questions, but I'm going to stick to two, one slightly smaller, one slightly bigger. My slightly smaller one, Riccardo, it's really helpful the emphasis you place on sustainability not being about freedom for animals. I wonder if it's useful to think about the agency of animals with this question at all. Ethologists now categorize animal behavior and identify some kinds of behavior, boldness, behavioral flexibility, an interest in new things in some species as actually making them winners to some small extent anyway, in the way humans treat their environments. Foxes and crows might be examples. And Erica Fudge has done really interesting work on the agency of domesticated animals like cows and horses with a great capacity to cause injury to their riders. So I wonder if, rather than viewing animals as a whole, we can bring in their response. Animal excrement on highways in the fens in England is immensely disruptive to all kinds of profitable economic ventures, for example. So that's my smaller question. My bigger question is, and maybe it's not such a small question, we're talking a lot about time and humans rather than space and environments. And so my bigger question is, do we have to adapt our definitions of and thinking about sustainability to different environments, some of which are more populated, some of which have more useful resources from a human perspective? Yeah, there's a lot of emphasis in eco-critical thinking on how in contemporary times we talk all about environments and no one has paid enough attention to time, which is where we historians can be useful. But do us historians, most of us not very well trained in geographical expertise, how do we handle the question of environments and space?
Very, very good and difficult questions. About the first one, yes, I agree. The concept of agency of the animals is fundamental. And I was wondering, as you were talking, if we could redefine the idea, the definition of sustainability without using the word human, which is still present, I think, in all the definition of sustainability. So I think for sure we should cancel or eliminate some words as development, needs, human needs, future generations. But on the other hand, humans are within the environment, are part of the environment, and their nature is also to interact with the rest of the environment. They can also create biodiversity, especially with traditional practices. I haven't answered to your question, but just to put some insight in the debate.
Thank you.
Can I just briefly ask you, Sophie, are you sort of criticizing the anthropocentric dimension of sustainability?
In the sense of it viewing living things as things to which things are done, yes, and I don't want to undermine the sense of the extremity and horror of what is done to them. I also think it's interesting. It's not important maybe from an environmental perspective, but it's interesting that some animals, raccoons, foxes, do some animals do adapt to human environments and do quite well, and some animals are transported. I mean, maybe and then we give these names like invasive species, but
no, but that's for sure and for certain. You know, it has always been the case in terms of, I mean, looking at it from the longue durée, say the last 3 million years, from the development of hominids within there, we don't call it environment. In German, we say Mitwelt rather than Umwelt. I don't know what it would be in English, but it's so, rather than saying here as humans and there our environment, the surrounding, it's rather a commonwealth. So it's Mitwelt and not Umwelt. And I mean, the interaction between culture, or what we call culture, and the natural dimension, spatial and chronological, you know, That's part of a big project called Rocky in Frankfurt and Tübingen, and they investigate the role of culture in the human, in the expansion of humans out of Africa to all the continents. And I think that one of the mythologies or the bad narratives about these developments are, for example, the extinction theory. So the idea that wherever humans turn up, on which continent they come, they make sure that you extinct the big mammals. So you can prove that if you want. I mean, Alan Weisman is one of the people who is actually saying that. So meaning that, we cannot do anything about it. Humans are destroyers, big destroyers, and that's it. And I think what you are suggesting is, and what the Tübingen project is looking at, is there are interactions all the time, and humans are part of nature rather than a factor that influences them. I mean, we are influenced. So that's maybe something you could look at it. Rocky, ROCCEH, Rocky, the role of nature in the early expansion of humans. And they look at it in the longue durée.
Thank you.
Thank you. Andrew, go ahead.
Great, thanks, Amanda. Thanks to both of you for these papers, really, really interesting. So I have a question for each of you. So for Riccardo, I was really interested to hear if in your research you've seen moments of like kind of popular resistance to these controls and these regulations and this kind of quite coercive, profit-driven form of sustainability that you've mapped out for us, because and whether in people breaking onto land to cut trees down or trying to maintain older practices or subvert the rules, whether we see alternative ideas of sustainability come out of that competition. So yeah, a question about kind of resistance to these rules that we might straightforwardly think of as sustainability, but obviously had hierarchies and power in all the ways that you described. And then for Annette, I'm really excited to read your book, and it's really, really interesting. And I'm not a medievalist, but I was just interested to learn how, when you were conceptualizing the book, sort of how you thought about, and this is kind of similar to Amanda's question, really, how you thought about some of the risks of packaging certain practices or ideas in terms that in 2024 we would recognize. So the one that jumped out to me in the contents was microfinancing. And again, I'm not a medievalist, but were people using the word microfinancing in the Middle Ages? Maybe they were, but they probably weren't. But what are the kind of risks of sort of labeling something as a sustainable practice that we would recognize today as a medievalist, I suppose, while also trying to make it a usable past and something that we can draw a lesson from? Thanks.
Okay, thank you for the question. And let me say something about the sources I have used. So I usually work on sources produced by communities, urban or rural communities, and the documentation preserved in the archives was produced by the communities, and especially, I could say, by the elites ruling the communities. So we have a lot of deeds mentioning the management of the commons, commons sold by the communes to private investors, and sometimes you can find the art was approved by almost all the councillors. So you have say some clues about our resistance. Sometimes the resistance is clearer. So we have acts where we can find the protestation of the whole population to this kind of acts. But the interesting thing is that there are many segments inside these communities, which are, and sometimes the aristocrats are the protagonists of the defense and the protections of the collective use of the soil. Why? Because they have a lot of cattle and flocks, and they want to have the collective use of the meadows. On the other hand, the communities prefer to sell the majority of the commons and to safeguard just few woods, especially in the flatlands, just few woods for the copies and the production and the needs of the just the basic needs, and maybe to invest on Owen, other kinds of commons, mills, which are a sort of public services, public facilities, which give benefits for the whole communities. So just to say that yes, we can have evidence of the social conflict, and on the other hand, we have situations which varies locality by locality.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew, for the question. As to the terminology, I mean, using present day language, I would say we as historians do not have an alternative. Using the language of the sources is really not an alternative as long as history wants to be a science in an academic sense. Because I remember a talk I gave on medieval inauguration rites. And I talked about liminal process. And then because it's, you know, an elevation of a king from one status to another. And then there came this question from my listeners of a colleague from ancient history and said, well, now, can we do this? Did they know this was a liminal process? Of course not. But it's not, I mean, I'm a historian. I'm not wanting to be a medieval king, and I'm not wanting to be speaking in their language. I mean, we have to go to that language and we have to understand it. But then, of course, we cannot be historians unless we go the next step. And then there is a second problem with medieval historians or history very often. We mistake the language of the 19th century for medieval language. So take, for example, the German context. We have a big topic that is, even if you don't know anything about medieval history, you know investiture contest. That's what everybody knows, yeah? So, but then if you look at it, I mean, no single person in the Middle Ages used the term investiture contest. It's a term that was used in the 19th century for describing the process and the conflict between Henry IV and Gregory VII. So, but still we think investiture contest is a medieval sort of adequate terminology, whereas, you know, it's just 19th century language. By the way, in German, north of the Alps in Germany, in the 11th and early 12th century, I mean, how many people knew about this conflict between the two or wrote about it? There is only one single source about it, which is a unical chronicle by a very depressive old monk. But for the rest, nobody, you know, they didn't know about it. So anyway, so that's my answer to your question about terminology. Thank you for the question, because I think that is a very, very important one. And if we don't want to lose our voice in current and present day contexts, we have to get rid of 19th century language and categories.
I have to say, I really enjoyed your assault on the idea that modern thinking is kind of cutting edge rather than 19th and 20th century thinking. So a little while ago in the chat was a question from Hazim Asghari. I don't know if Hazim's still here, and whether you'd like to put the question yourself, Hazim, or whether I should read it. But I'm happy to start reading. So Annette mentioned that this is the question, that we can find what we today call sustainability in the past, but at the same time that we can find inspiration for alternatives in the past. How exactly are both these statements true? And then the second part of the question, it seems to me that the first statement only confirms that what we're looking for isn't new, but how do we actually take inspiration from the past to build alternatives for today?
Well, I do just, want to liberate our imagination. The one thing people often expect from us historians is really lessons from the past, how to do this or that. And then they would maybe say, okay, let's live like we used to live in a monastery under Benedict's rule. Of course not. But what you can see from there is that people gave each other or their communities certain rules to make common life possible. And if I look at my students or cooperatives they are working in and so on and so forth, I mean, they are making up, concepts. How do we want to work together in this cooperative and supply ourselves with the fruits of our own labor, or buy only a sustainable vegetable or whatever, or green vegetable. So you see, they give themselves rules, and they are different rules from what we had in the Middle Ages, but you can take from the past. Yes, it did work. There was a time when other rules worked than our rules today. So I would say inspiration to get, the courage to give yourself the rules you think might be good for a sustainable way to organize your community, or the way we are interacting with each other and all the, whatever belongs to the whole as a, I don't want to say environment, so I hope Hazim, that's an answer to your question, but it's very important. It's not about imitation. It's about liberating the imagination, and the history is full of diversity in terms of, people did so many things so differently from us today. So why should it not be possible to do things differently from us today in the future without, getting stuck? So it's just breaking up the myth of there is no alternative and trying to find new ways to do things.
We could take John's question now and then come to the next one in the chat from Matthew.
Thanks, both of you. Those were both really, really interesting discussions, papers, and discussion. So I think my question is sort of in two parts, and I'll put the first bit of it relatively provocatively, just for clarity's sake, which is, so the statement, there is nothing useful to generalize around the Middle Ages about sustainability. It's not useful to generalize about sustainability in relation to the Middle Ages. So that would be, the sort of discuss question you'd set an undergraduate, if you like. Insofar as some practices we might, from our contemporary sustainability perspective, view as useful, others we might not view as useful. So really what we're talking about here, it seems to me, is past practices of whatever period that appear to be, to use Annette's word, sort of inspirational in one way, shape or form. So I think there's nothing. None of us, I think, here are interested in reifying the Middle Ages. And I think that's that slippage, if you like, Annette, from the German title of the book to the British version or the Anglo version of the book is very, as Amanda was sort of pointing out, is very interesting in that respect. I think actually we're not talking about, none of us probably really believe in the Middle Ages as a concept in and of itself. So I don't think we're talking about medieval sustainability as per se as something that's necessarily very, very helpful. And I think all, Riccardo, your points sort of echo that too. So that would be the first kind of comment question. The second bit then is really to do with this inspiration imitation kind of question, Annette, that you've just sort of touched on, and it's thinking about, well, what are the mechanics of moving? Is there anything that historians should be doing beyond simply pointing to interesting past alternatives that call into question current arrangements? Is there anything really historians should be doing beyond that, or is that enough? And at one level, one could say it's enough, or one could say historians should be doing more policy-orientated work. And there are medieval historians who are doing that. John Haldon, Bas van Bavel. There are numerous people you can kind of point to in that respect. But given that, going back to your Eleanor Ostrom point, Annette, given that precisely what you're kicking against is the received wisdom of a society, that's a very deep set of presuppositions to be trying to fight against. So it's actually very difficult to simply, as it were, let the examples speak for themselves. So my question is, what do any of us think? And it's not, it's not a medieval question, actually, it's just a historian's question. What do any of us think is useful by way of interventions to kind of move, to make that, to connect with the inspiration in practice, I suppose, is the second bit of the question.
Riccardo, are you
Yeah.
starting? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for this question. And I would like just to add another aspect, which concerns the research on the ground, say. So as historians, we can also work in space with communities, trying also to intervene in current choices on landscape and in the transformation of the environment. So I think I live in a hilly area, and I know very well the role of the dry walls and the safeguard of the dry walls, or the ancient forms of irrigations. And this, I think, just to answer briefly to your question, I think interdisciplinarity is another keyword which we should use, and we could also ask as historians, which is our role in interdisciplinary projects. So we are the, I don't know, a minor discipline trying to say something about the past, or may we to lead complex projects in the field of sustainability and the transformation of the landscape.
Annette, did you have anything you wanted to say on this one? We might have lost connection again.
Yeah.
Hi.
I'm back. Indeed, I lost connection for a moment. But can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Yes, well, John, your question, I mean, my answer would be getting involved. I think that's our task as historians, and maybe on 3 different levels. I mean, we should definitely, as historians, promote long-term thinking, because I think one of the problems of our present is, and also of the lack of imagination for potential futures, that we have a very short-term thinking. We think in quarterly sort of profits and outcomes in companies, which makes us very short-sighted. So historians, per definition, should promote long-term thinking. That helps a lot and would be bringing back the dimension of time into current discussions. And then I think we should argue for incentives for ways of behaving, ways of consuming, and ways of making decisions that are that are good for the future. So making sure that we say we need more incentives in an economical sense for behaving in a pro-future way. In German, we say enkeltauglich, meaning, you know, in a way that is good for the grandchildren or for the generation of the grandchildren. And I think there we definitely need incentives. We must change the system where it's very cheap to, you know, produce waste, and it's very expensive not to produce it. So that's a thing which I think should historians do as well, and also showing how short-term developments these were. I mean, the throwaway society, the Frank Trentmann shows it. You know, it's a development of the 60s, yeah. So it's an after Second World War invention, and plastic has been so cheap only since the markets have been flooded with cheap oil in the 1950s. Christian, what is the colleague of Bern? He coined the term the 50s syndrome. Christian Pfister, yeah, the 1950s syndrome. And I think if we realize, oh, this is not a very long term, it has not been times out of mind, it has been the last 2.5 generations. And then the final thing is really, I mean, that's for all of us who are academics and teaching at universities, give tailwind to whatever the young generation and the generations of the futures develop as ideas and concepts for a future, rather than, you know, discouraging and saying, oh, we had that before, or that was already there and didn't work. I think we should give all our tailwind and allow them to make mistakes, but at least try. That again, I would say, is our responsibility as academics or as teachers at universities.
Matthew, would you like to put your question directly?
Well, it was simply to pick up on, just to ask for references. I'm not an academic. I'm just a kind of punter, really. But very interested in the way Annette described the importance, if history wants to be scientific, of adapting new concepts, so neologisms even, and using them as lenses to better treat the subjects of the past. Just wondered if, I mean, that sounds like there must be a bit of a methodology that's already been discussed in behind that. And I was just seeking references to any pointers that anyone's got to that kind of discussion.
Matthew, thank you. A very good question. Maybe I should write a paper on that one. And then I can send it to you. I'm sure there are discussions about it. I mean, Graeber and people like that, they, you know, they are not historians, but they use a lot of historical case studies and they use language which is up to date. So there are lots of people who do it, but methodologically, I had to think about it. Yeah.
Anthropologists tend to tie themselves in knots of relativism when they talk about this. So I was quite interested in the historiographical perspective.
Yeah. No, I needed to think. Maybe someone else knows. You know, we are all here specialists, so.
Well, David Wengrow is an archaeologist, so I mean, his room's
He's
just...
a historian in terms of the ways he thinks. Yeah.
Well, actually, if anyone's got any suggestions for things they find helpful on this, then put them in the chat. Just so that just time is beginning to diminish. Well, I guess it's been doing that all along. But we have one question here from JD. I don't know whether you'd like to put it yourself if you're still here, JD. Or, well, I'll
We see you, JD. You are still here.
Oh, okay. So
Yeah.
right,
audio is not working for them.
I
we can see it in the
okay.
chat, but I'll just ask it so that we can all be sure we've heard. So I have a question about the different definitions of sustainability that exist in current contexts versus in medieval European contexts. Our current understanding of sustainability originated in the 1970s as a result of studies examining the carrying capacity of the Earth. Our current context and the reason for our desperation for more sustainable systems is an environment where the limits of our natural world are put in stark view on a global scale. In your research, have you found that the medieval European context, the reasons for sustainable management come from any similar place? How aware were those people of the times of the carrying capacities of their local or regional environments? A really interesting question.
I think actually the reason for sustainability for people in the Middle Ages was utilitas. They needed to make sure they can use their resources, what we call today resources, in a long-term perspective. And I think they might have had, you know, they seem to have had a better sense of, if you want to survive, we have to make sure we don't strip our forests. Of course, that did not always work. Riccardo will probably say the opposite, happened very often, but still, I don't think it is what the 1970s called care for the environment. You know, it's not about care for the environment, not at all. And I don't think the future will be care for the environment. Our future will be care for us in a sense of, you know, the planet will survive. Nature will survive without us. But the question is whether it remains a friendly place for humans. And that is the problem. As to the definition of sustainability, I mean, sustainability in a German sense, Nachhaltigkeit is actually a term that rises in the early 18th century. Hans Carl von Carlowitz, he was a forestry man in the Saxonian forests, and he coined this term. Anna Amalia from Saxon-Weimar, she later in the century then put through the first forest reform. And this was the time when they started using forests and wood for all the mines, the silver mines in the Saxonian forest. So they made sure that the use of the forests would be done in a way that would allow, you know, to use the forests also in the next and over next generation. But some of us say that, you know, sustainability is actually an invention of the beginning industrialization, when you really need to make the resources the most resourceful. Hans Carl von Carlowitz, I mean, he was a very good forestry man, and also I found it very interesting that Anna Amalia from Saxon would be the first woman to put it through. But I think we can define sustainability at a way to manage resources that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. That's more or less what Anna Amalia also said in her forestry reform in the year 700 and I think 65.
And another advantage, the medieval society had compared to the current one is that is at the scale, the geographical scale. So they were working on the sustainability in a local space. So they could measure the existence of the resources. So I totally agree with you, Annette. Their problem was to make durable a resource. So they were speaking of resources. I think probably I disagree with recent Mathieu Arnaud's book on resources. I think medieval societies had very clear the idea of a resource, but they also could place the resource into the space, the local space, and so in this case they could measure up the resources very well compared to our current globalized society. And about the definitions of sustainability, or about the birth of the concept of sustainability, I like to ask to Annette something about Justus von Liebig, because I think that Justus von Liebig on the half of the 19th century, working on the soil fertility, was, I think, among the first scholars formulating this idea.
Actually, Justus von Liebig, he was much later. Hans Carl von Carlowitz, he was in 1705. And Justus von Liebig, he was the inventor of artificial fertilizer in the late 19th and early 20th century, winning the Nobel Prize in 1900 and I think 23 for that fantastic invention, which is now, however, the biggest problem we have, because nitrates are even worse than CO2. So his invention is actually responsible probably for the bigger disturbance in our planetary system than CO2 is. But Hans Carl von Carlowitz, I mean, the Germans make a big god out of him because he was a German. So, that's but in the German world, so nachhaltig is first traceable in the dictionaries in that book of his, which is called Silvicultura Economica. Silvicultura Economica. I can try and do it in the but it's a very sort of known start of the, wait a minute, I try to get it to everybody. Silvicultura Economica, Hans Carl von Carlowitz. I think it's 1705 or something. So that's the beginning of sustainability in the German context.
And there's an observation in the chat from Hazim, rather, I think, than a question, but let's have it. The last point on Neutralitas is interesting. It seems to me that modern society needs a sustainability motivated by a different purpose, namely a global ethic of restraint or care for other species. This is particularly because other purposes have landed us in a tough spot. International treaties and economic levers do not work on the scale or the type of use of the environment that we practice today. Carbon emissions, atmosphere as commons, I think that's a nice way of thinking about that, have not been able to be regulated through either the non-binding COP agreements or carbon pricing.
Well, they have been, because there are some of us who think that carbon price is still too low. We should put it up. Hazim, I think we cannot, you know, we didn't make the rules, but we have to sort of play to it. So that's why I before said we need to change the incentives. This should make carbon emission very, very expensive, and we should put in our voice for promoting that in political discussions, for example, and promoting alternative ways to get energy and so on and so forth. And also, I would always avoid the dichotomy between utilitas and global ethics. Global ethics is about utilitas. It's, you know, it is very important not to idealize ethics as something that is about being a good person and have moral values and so on and so forth. No, ethics is, ever since Aristotle invented it, in term, don't misunderstand me, but it's about how to lead a good life. And that life cannot be led individually. It has to be led within the surroundings of whatever we have. We are part of a bigger thing. So I don't think there is much of a point in putting up sort of this dichotomous way of thinking and saying, we don't need utilitas, we need ethics. No, ethics is about doing reasonable things for all of us, for the good of everybody. The problem is rather individual profit. And that's a different thing. That's nothing to do with utilitas.
Riccardo, did you have something you wanted to say then as well?
Yeah, I was thinking about Annette's words. And I think that, however, there is a point in the dichotomy between ethics and utilitas. And it is still related to the concept of resource. So if you think of the environment as a resource, you are thinking about the utilitas. But if you think, but ethics is something more, is something beyond utilitas. For instance, I have written a book about wolves, trying to argue that wolves had a fundamental role in safeguarding the ecosystem, and wolves obviously were hunted to extinction by medieval societies. But I'm also aware that breeders have a fundamental role in safeguarding meadows and other ecological values. So if you want to save both, if you want to save the traditional economies driven by shepherds, also nowadays, and if you want to save wolves, we need to have something more of a utilitas. We need also probably an intervention by the state, which is led by ethics. I was saying that we need to conceive that in the concept of sustainability, we need to include the opposite of profit. I don't know, graciousness, something for free, and that's the point related to ethics.
That may be a good note to finish on. We're very close to the end of the hour, so perhaps at that point, unless there's anything unless anyone has anything that they would really like to throw in at the end, I'd really like to thank our two speakers for what's been a really productive and kind of inspiring discussion about how to use these quite apparently presentist and tricky concepts to really do something useful. So thank you so much for that. John,
thank you very much. It was very interesting, and thank you for all the comments and questions, and I learned a lot. Thank you.
Yes, me too. Thank you very much.
And John, did you have something to say about the next one?
No. Next one is until next term, so there's nothing.
Right. Okay. So we'll see some of you again next year for the next one.
Super. Thank you all so much.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.